For the race weekend, c'est fini.
Well, in the end, in relatively fine weather in Austria, so much for the thunderstorms, it was another brilliant performance by Max Verstappen and Red Bull Honda, absolutely maximising their package. Max led from the pole, controlled the race from the start, had enough margin towards the end to come in for a second set of hard tyres. Why wouldn't you after what happened in Baku? And also, of course, that enabled him then to set fastest lap. So he did it all, the pole, start to finish, and set fastest lap, got that extra point. It's looking supremely good now for Max Verstappen. He's winning these races like world champions in the making, isn't he? But it was Lando Norris who nonetheless did not disappoint after his amazing qualifying performances yesterday on both the medium and the soft tyre. Lando made a very good start, immediately moved to the left off the line, so he had the outside approach into turn one. He got quite a good exit out of one, but already Max had half a car's length on him, and that was kind of the early phase of the race. The Red Bull just had more efficient downforce, more grip than the McLaren, those two high-rate cars proving to be the best two chassis around Austria. Mercedes kind of struggling to keep up. Valtteri got him initially for half a lap, and then Lewis repassed him. But they could do nothing, as we've been saying all weekend, and indeed last week, about McLaren's top speed. There was an emphatic demonstration of high rate versus the rate level of Mercedes. You won't call it low rate because they do have a certain degree of angle at the back of the car there, but it's not enough on circuits like Austria, quite clearly, to take the race even to McLaren now. So Lando Norris and McLaren did a lot today. Lando almost beat Valtteri on the line. Got to say, he was within 2 seconds at the end of the race. But much more importantly, he basically meant that Lewis Hamilton finished fourth rather than second, because Valtteri probably wouldn't have overtaken Lewis had there not been a Lando Norris in the race there to beat. But that wasn't all. Lando also had to overcome a ridiculous, in my view, 5-second penalty for forcing another driver off the track. That other driver was Sergio Perez in the Red Bull Honda, who, after a restart quite early in the race, was obviously fired up. He had a lot of grip, he had a lot of balance in that Red Bull, and he was moving all over the road behind Lando. Went around the outside of him at turn 4, which is asking for trouble, as we've seen before, as we've seen with the Alex Albon thing at the same corner with the same team. Lando, in my view, did absolutely nothing wrong. He just came out of the corner as he normally would. Yeah, of course, there wasn't a lot of room on the outside, but then why would there be? You're on the outside. You're not going to be dictating the corner or the position of your car in the corner. So he ran onto the dirt, Sergio that is, got on the radio straight away and said, he forced me off the track. And within three or four laps came the news that Lando had been given a 5-second penalty. To repeat the point, I think that was completely unjust. And the irony of all this is that Sergio, later on in the race, trying to pass Charles Leclerc's Ferrari, Leclerc putting another of his excellent drives together from nowhere on the grid, really, twice took Leclerc off the circuit. Once going into the same corner, turn 4, when he actually hit Charles, and a completely different thing to Lando, he actually hit Charles, moved the Ferrari on the road and then off onto the dirt. And he did get a 5-second penalty himself, Perez that is. And then later on, about 10 minutes later, going into the 5-6 section after turn 4 into the left, he ran Charles wide again. So this is a different Sergio Perez. Well, I've often made the point, let me rephrase it. I've often made the point in these videos of how good Sergio is in defense. I think he's one of the best defense drivers in Formula One, and we've seen that over the years. But I've never really gone on about what he's like in attack mode. And I thought what we saw from Perez today was absolutely crass. And he could have been P2 in that car. It was a very, very good race car today. And as it was, he finished, P6 or something like that, way down the field. Should not have been there. This was the first race in which Sergio Perez has not looked like the sort of driver that they need in the other car alongside Max Verstappen. But none of this should detract from some of the great driving we saw at the front of the race, particularly when Lando Norris was running with Lewis behind him. Lando wasn't actually having to go offline to defend. He just had enough margin, and Lewis was finding it quite difficult to sit in the dirty air of the McLaren. And this was, I think, a definitive moment, because there was Lewis in a car that patently wasn't as quick on this day as a McLaren Mercedes, for other reasons to do with rake. but he was driving absolutely beautifully. And you could see by about half a metre on any of the corners that were real corners, rather than sort of turn 10, which is defined by the geography, defined by the line there after 9. But if you take corners like, well, you could the approach to 3, I guess, certainly 4, 5, and 6, you could see there that Lewis, behind Lando, was using half a metre less corner going in, shorter corners, in other words, doing all the things that he does with a race car. Now, I'm maybe the world's biggest Lando Norris fan. I've been a fan of his, certainly since he was in Formula 3, and I think he's absolutely fabulous, and I love his touch and feel and the suppleness of his inputs and his sheer racer's instinct. And here I wanted to see Lando mirroring exactly what Lewis was doing with the car. But I got to say, I thought it was quite interesting that he wasn't. His corners are definitely longer on entry than Lewis's. So if there's an area where Lando either needs to improve or where he's just going to be different from Lewis, it's on the entry to the corners. He's definitely going in slightly wider, slightly longer corner. And that will always, in the long run, over a full Grand Prix distance, tyre for tyre, car for car, put more energy through the tyres. And that's all it means, really. It doesn't mean to say it's quicker or slower. It just means that Lewis, with the way he drives, is more able to manage the tyres because of his shorter corners. Having said all of that, of course, it was in this pursuit of the amazing Lando Norris that Lewis basically lost second place because he made a mistake in the dirty air coming out of 10, damaged that aero surface at the back of the car, the aero surfaces, and thereafter the car was never as quick as, say, Valtteri Bottas's Mercedes, and equally had a few lockups going into turn 3 as well. They weren't really a drama, and it was yet another example of how a very, very good driver, even if he locks up going into 3 and he misses the apex, providing he gets the car rotated correctly, he can get the acceleration run, and he loses virtually no time at all, as we saw years ago when Michael did that on what was potentially a pole lap, and it still was a pole lap. Anyway, that's turn 3. It's an interesting corner in Austria in that sense. But it was Lando's driving that, if you like, forced Lewis into those errors and which created the race that resulted in Valtteri Bottas being P2 and Lando P3. There was a moment too, of course, maybe it was a defining moment, I don't know, when Lando actually passed Lewis Hamilton after their pit stops, and it was, he just did it beautifully. In turn 4, he got the run on the DRS, but he didn't actually have track position, and going into 5, Lewis was sort of moved to the right. I think he was half thinking, I can't really hold this guy up, but Lando just lost no time, straight down the inside. Lovely to see. He drove superbly, Lando, I thought, and as he correctly pointed out after the race, had he not had that 5-second penalty, he probably would have been P2 ahead of Valtteri. You know, that's a debatable point because we don't know how hard Valtteri could have pushed the car, I guess, before they gave him permission to pass Lewis, whose car was ailing with the downforce problem. They might have given that to Valtteri a little bit earlier. On that subject, though, I have to question Mercedes saying to Valtteri, even though the instruction only stood for about 3 laps, which this was after the pit stops, that Lewis had damaged his left rear, the aero, and to control your position, not to race Lewis. And they said that categorically at a time when Lando Norris was catching him at about 0.3 of a second a lap, and quite clearly was going to be on him within about 5 or 6 laps. And I thought, wow, you know, this is are Mercedes actually going to sacrifice a position in order just to protect Lewis and not have Bottas in front of Lewis? But they then, I don't know whether they were just slow off the mark or whether they just had a big internal discussion or what, because about 2 laps later they said to Valtteri, no, go past Lewis, make sure you beat Lando Norris. But it was a funny little moment when you thought, what are Mercedes thinking here? Because it's a very good chance that Lando could pass both of them and be P2 here and take even more points. But that didn't happen in the end, as we saw. So very good drives. Obviously, brilliant drive by Max. Very good drive by Valtteri, really. I mean, he made it clear on the radio that he was driving according to the instructions of the team, plan A, plan B, whatever it was, controlling his lap times, didn't damage the car excessively on any of the curbs, like Lewis. and got P2. A lot of pressure from Lando at the end because Lando was actually quicker on the road than Valtteri, quicker through the air in terms of top speed. The McLaren's aero really, really impressive. And but Lando couldn't get to within the second he needed in order to get the benefit of the DRS. So he eventually finished P3, but as I say, it could have been P2. Lewis was fourth, and Carlos Sainz drove very well, but Ferraris actually looked much better today, a bit like Daniel Ricciardo has kind of, put him in a race situation, put Daniel in a race situation, and they sort of come alive. And for most of the race, Daniel was doing, some laps he was 0.6 slower than Lando. Other laps, towards the end of the race, he was within about 0.2, 0.3 of Lando. It's still a massive gap between the young British megastar and the Australian Grand Prix winner, who should, in reality, be right there with Lando, if not slightly ahead of him. But it was a good day for Daniel. He did some racing and he got out there. But Ferrari recovered well too. And Carlos Sainz, who started on the hard tyre, the only driver who started on the hard, and of course they were out of the top 10 so they could choose their tyres. It was a very good choice. I'm surprised Moore didn't do that actually, because towards the end of the race he had a lot more grip than his teammate Charles Leclerc, who had gone the opposite. He'd gone from medium to the hard tyre. And also back end of that race, when other drivers were ailing, bit of oversteer, bit of understeer, lots of stuff going on, it was a good tyre combination to be on. So Carlos Sainz did very well to finish fifth. Sergio Perez was, as I say, all over the place. And Daniel Ricciardo, in the end, a good drive, kind of, to finish seventh ahead of Charles Leclerc. So that was the Austrian Grand Prix. It's just going to be a Max Verstappen, Red Bull Honda show at the moment, and the fans are loving it. 160-odd thousand over the 3 days in Austria. Lewis Hamilton got on the radio. I think this was probably a moment that summed up this Grand Prix. He got on the radio after they'd made their first stops to see again why Max had managed to extend his lead and what had happened there with those changes to the hard tyres. Well, the answer is, Lewis, that on the in and out lap, again, Max had you beaten 2.1 seconds quicker in total. He was quicker on the in lap, quicker on the out lap as well. And his pace at the end, when he came in for that second set of hards and went out and set fastest lap, 6.2, went at 6.2. It's like 2 seconds quicker than anybody else had been doing all day. Of course, he was on the new tyres, but that was Max Verstappen in mode 2 with the engine, not using a lot of curb, showing that he is the total master of everything at the moment in Formula One. Good to see. The fans loved it. Let's see if he continues that at Silverstone in 2 weeks' time.